My name is Rick Davis. I own Coastline Home Inspection. We're based right here in Sarasota. We're servicing pretty much all up down the southwest corridor here, up to Brandon, down to Punta Gorda, and additionally out to Hardy County and DeSoto County as well. We are an FAA certified drone pilot. So we can get up on those roofs where their other guys won't climb up on. We'll fly up over them and get nice tight shots with our drones. And it makes amazing photographs. We can zoom in real tight to see any imperfections that we might find on the roof area. Of course, we're home inspectors. We provide the same services that most all home inspectors provide: buyers, sellers inspections, 4-point wind mits, etc. But we do have a lot of attention to detail. And one thing that you're not going to have coming out of any coastline inspection is an inspector that's an alarmist. Okay, we're not seeing, oh my God, this is the worst roof I've ever seen in my entire life. What are you even thinking about buying this? That's not my job. That's your job to deal with that. Okay. So anyway, pleasure to be here, and good luck to everybody. I hope you have a very successful 2022 coming up. And let you guys get to it. Okay. Thanks.
So we're gonna move that so we can kind of see
Oh,
what it,
absolutely. Yeah, you want to, are you sitting? Oh, okay.
yeah, is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine. I'll move the, give me a minute to move the camera to kind of
Sorry.
capture you guys. But no, it's okay.
We've got good chemistry, but not like stand-up comedian chemistry, so.
Debatable.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm used to doing these in the morning, so I must say good morning. I'm Erin Christy. I'm a real estate attorney with Shoemaker, Loop and Kendrick. I handle residential and commercial closings, spend a lot of time in the FAR bar contract. And here, you know, in Sarasota along the Gulf Coast, we come across condo and HOA questions a lot. And some, you know, they're handled within the contract and we can answer there. And some you're really kind of getting into the nitty gritty, which is where Doug Christy comes in. You'll notice we have the same last name. We are actually married, and we kind of run in the same realm of the real estate world, but practice very different, you know, areas of law. So I'll let Doug cover what he does and we'll jump right in.
I'm a humble community association attorney. We are friendly. We are not mean. I'm a sole practitioner. I'm board certified in condominium and plan development law, and I regularly represent community associations, condos, HOAs, etc. Occasionally, I represent other related parties, but the bulk of my practice is assisting associations with litigation, transactional matters, general corporate governance issues, and enforcing their documents.
Great. Okay, with that, we will jump right in. So with some of this, we'll go through the contract and kind of what it says and how it works and give you some practical pointers. And then we'll also go into, you know, a deeper dive into some of the HOA and condo laws that come up that aren't necessarily a closing agents to answer. So oftentimes you'll see them say, I'm not sure, you need to get other counsel. And that's where Doug will jump in.
And then questions, we're gonna do.
Yeah, common questions, frequently asked questions, and then at the end we'll do a Q&A.
Yeah, right,
Yes,
okay.
and I understand that somebody will be monitoring the chat and helping us through those. So this is my first time doing hybrid. It will be fun. I know it will go well, and here we go. So in the FAR bar contract at paragraph 9, it outlines who pays for what. And in the HOA and condominium context, where this comes up are in HOA and condominium association estoppel fees. And then a separate fee is an application or transfer fee. So Doug, do you want to talk about what, you know, estoppel is such a weird word. People say, you know, we don't even know what that is. Can you talk about what estoppel fees are, how much an association is allowed to charge, and what you do in those cases where you have more than one association?
Okay, so estoppel fees are the cost incurred by the association that they're entitled to charge to provide a certificate that's intended to be relied upon for the parties at closing that says what's owed to the association for that particular piece of property, what other issues exist, if any, in relation to that property. In the condo context, it gets into insurance. It's essentially a written guarantee that the parties are intended to rely upon for closing purposes so that everybody knows who's obligated for what, from the perspective of the seller and the purchaser.
And let me stop you there and why
Okay,
that matters. So the reason that we're asking for this in a contract is because we need it for title insurance purposes. We need to know that when the buyer takes title, they're taking it free and clear of any liens that the association may have, any amounts owed to the association. So you want to know that when this property transfers, all of those things are paid. And so the estoppel is relied upon by the title company, the closing attorney, to say, okay, these are the amounts that we need to account for on the closing statement. Okay, so amounts. How much can an association charge? I see different prices.
So the statute was amended several years ago to prescribe fees. The maximum under the statute is $500. It's $250 for a typical estoppel. If there's no amounts owed and there's no rush, $250 is what the statute prescribes.
But I want to close in 3 days.
Then you have to pay the expedited fee, which I believe is $100.
Okay.
And if there's amounts owed, they can tack on another $150. So if you check all three of those boxes, you need an estoppel, you need a rush, and there's money owed, they can charge you up to $500. Not to get too far into the weeds, but I take the perspective that estoppel certificate fees prescribed by statute aren't binding on attorneys because the legislature can't regulate the practice of law. So you may come into contact with different fees and you might need to pay attention to who's sending you that. If it's coming from a management company or some other non-attorney party, they should be following what the statute says. If it's coming from an attorney for the association, you can get into other amounts being claimed that may or may not dovetail with what the statute says.
Okay, so if you see an amount greater than $500,
Hopefully it's coming from an attorney. It's probably legit and probably not worth the fight,
okay.
but that's a personal perspective.
But good to know as you're, helping people review their closing statements, the estoppel fee, there are caps in many circumstances, and just to question them to the extent that they don't look quite right.
Right. And I think the statute prescribes 15 days to provide it under normal circumstances. They're also supposed to be good for either 30 or 35 days, depending upon how they're transmitted. If they're sent by mail, it's 35 days from the date of transmission. If they're sent electronically, they're valid for 30 days. And the associations always have the right to revise them at no additional expense. So if there's a 30 days or 35 days, it's a pretty substantial period of time. Something can change. An assessment may come due that wasn't originally known when that original estoppel certificate was issued. So it's always possible that they get updated and that might change the amounts claimed to be due. And again, no expense for the update. If you request an update, that's another thing.
But if there is
doing
one
it
issue, it should
voluntarily,
happen.
right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then if there's more than one association, can they each charge up to $500?
Yep.
Same things apply. Each association gets their own bucket.
Yep, same fees for 720 for homeowners association, same fees for condos. A master association is probably more likely an HOA than a condo, but yeah, if they're separate associations, separate amounts owed, there can be separate estoppel fees for each.
Okay, so practical pointer on this. I know that there are realtors. I'm at the table a lot at closing statement explaining what an estoppel fee is, and I see sellers annoyed all the time that they have to pay an association to tell them that they paid the association. Really give that heads up at the beginning as you review fees, because you don't want to surprise. I've seen it come back on the realtors. I know it's not your fault. It is the contract, they signed it, but just one of those practical pointers as you deal with sellers who are in a condo in an HOA, like, hey, you're going to see this fee on your closing statement and you're contracting to pay for it. Now on the flip of that, the actual application and transfer fee, which comes up under the contract, if you don't change it, if it's not negotiated, is paid by the buyer. So they're going to submit the application. They're going to pay, whatever that fee is. Doug, is there a cap on what an association can charge for?
There's no cap in HOA land. So it's going to depend on what the documents say, assuming they say something about that. So, obviously whatever's reasonable should be the amount. In condo land, the fee is prescribed by statute. And I think it changed recently. It used to be $100, but I think it actually went up to 150 because it had been $100
Yeah.
for like 30 years or some incredibly long period of time. And that obviously lost a lot of efficacy. So I believe July 1st, the statute changed and upped it to $150, but that's the cap.
And I think this is a good time to stop, as I realize Doug says HOA land and condo land. So HOAs and condo associations, I've heard them used interchangeably. They are different. They are regulated by different statutes.
Right.
Doug, bird's eye view, 718 versus 720. So those are the different statutes. 718 covers condos, 720 covers HOAs.
Yep, that's correct.
Okay, and they are not identical. And you cannot assume that because it applies to condominium associations that it
Right.
applies to
So-
HOAs.
right,
and
so-
we'll go through some of that as we get through the riders.
Right, so condos are a specific form of property created by statute, and there's sort of check boxes you would need to meet to be considered a condominium. In HOAs, it probably defaults to everything that's not a condo. I mean, there's other forms of community associations like co-ops and mobile home parks, but I think for most residential transactions, you're probably dealing with one of those two, or some combination with a master and a condo or something like that. But by and large, you're generally dealing with a condo or an HOA, and probably 95% of your transactions, I would assume, that deal with an association.
Right. And this can really trip people up, even though something might look like single family homes that you might consider an HOA. You really have to look
Right.
at the documents, look at the deed and how it's defined, because there are land condominiums. And so it's technically a condominium.
Even though it might look like single family detached, I mean, it is single family detached homes. That doesn't mean it's an HOA. It could very well be.
And our only
Condo.
point here is to say, don't assume.
Right.
Okay, that's what the lawyers, the closing agent is there to help you through that, what that looks like and what applies, but just don't assume.
Even the names can be misnomers. I've seen HOAs with condo in the name, and I've seen condos with HOA in the name. The name doesn't determine what they are. It's what the documents creating the association do or don't do that really triggers that, one or the other.
Thanks. We should have covered that at the beginning.
Sorry.
So no, that's this is great. So with going back to the fees, with the transfer fee and the application fee, sometimes you see those paid directly by the buyer. I would say most times you see them paid by the buyer. But sometimes it comes up or the estoppel fee, for example. But sometimes it comes up that the closing agent is actually the one helping to order the estoppel. And so the closing agent pays for the estoppel fee up front. That is permitted under DFS, that fee gets paid by the closing agent up front, but it has to be reimbursed by the seller or by the buyer on the closing statement. So that's one of those rules maybe you've seen where closing agents, attorneys aren't allowed to kind of bribe you to use their services and say, well, we'll pay your estoppel fee. That's not permitted. They are permitted to pay them in advance so long as they are reimbursed on the closing statement. And sometimes you'll see a deal get so far down the line that the estoppel fee has been paid for, but then they cancel or terminate. And that is why you will see a closing agent reach out and say, hey, we actually need you to reimburse the closing fee, or the estoppel fee. So whether that actually gets paid or not, you will likely see a request that it gets paid. So they can check that box and say, look, we at least asked for them to pay it. Okay. So more into who pays what. The contract at Standard K outlines prorations. And within these prorations, we think of this in terms of real estate taxes, where the seller pays from January 1st through the closing date, and then the buyer pays from closing date through the end of the year. Similar thing happens with association fees. So unless you contract and negotiate for something different, your association fees are going to be prorated as of your closing date. So what this means is on a closing statement, sometimes you will see in a situation where assessments are paid in advance. So we're paying a quarter in advance, but we're closing in the middle of that quarter. You will actually see a credit back to the seller because the seller's already paid it, but they won't actually have it for the rest of the year. Quarter, yeah, right. So But if you're paying at the end of a quarter, sometimes you will see the credit from the seller to the buyer to make up for the time from the beginning of the quarter through closing, but they're not actually due until the end. So that can go on either side as you're reviewing a closing statement for somebody. Just kind of double check that you can check at the estoppel what's been paid in advance, what's due, to the extent that you're really getting into the nitty gritty with who pays for what. You can contract this away. This isn't statutory by any means. If part of the deal is the seller or the buyer wants the seller to pay association fees through the end of the year, that's fine, but you've got to write that into the contract. Otherwise, just assume it'll be prorated. That's what's normal. That's what happens 99.5% of the time. Okay. In the contract, you will see this special assessments. So the word special assessments also exists in the condo and HOA world. Cassidy, you have a question?
Yeah, someone asked, do you want to repeat the question so the rest of the but do these law guidelines apply to
Okay, so the question is, do these laws and guidelines apply to townhomes as well? I will say that I am not a townhome attorney, and Doug probably doesn't spend that much time in townhomes, but can you answer?
I mean, a townhome's not a legal thing, so.
Yeah,
a
so it's
townhome
typically
could
a
be
condo.
constructed in a way that it's subject to a condo form of ownership, and a townhome could be constructed and set up in a way that it's part of an HOA instead, or, could be under a master. So there's no townhomes are X or townhomes are Y. Townhomes can be anything technically.
And the key to whether, this is the short version, you're dealing with a condo or an HOA, a condo's legal description will include the word unit.
Yes, and the legal description will be based on a recorded declaration of condominium or something to that effect. Anything else is subdivided by plat, so you're going to have a lot block reference according to the plat of X in the plat book.
Right.
27 page 38 of the public records of
And
whatever
so
county.
my guess is the term townhomes is you're thinking of something with a party wall, and that could very well be a condominium where the unit is defined, from the inside of the party wall, to your side of the unit. And there's probably some sort of restriction about use of that party wall and what you can and can't do with it. So you'll see them, but
back to what we said earlier, you can't tell what it is by looking at it. Townhomes can be one thing, townhomes can be another thing. There's no one size fits all. You can look at it and tell that it must be an HOA or it must be a condo.
okay. So we're talking about special assessments. And so here in the contract where it addresses special assessments, this is not, and it specifically says in the contract that a public body does not include a condominium or homeowners association. So where you see this in the contract, and we're talking about who's going to pay for what. So the seller's going to pay for everything in advance of closing, or they're going to, split it. This has to do with public body special assessments. A good example of this, for those who have been, in real estate for the last 5-10 years, is out on Longboat Key. You saw the undergrounding special assessment that got put into place. It's now on the tax bills. That was considered a special assessment. Maybe a little bit like kind of into mid-county, you will see single family homes that are moving from a septic system and connecting to county water. Those sometimes have special assessments. That's what this is talking about. So don't assume that because you checked seller shall pay all special assessments due, prior to closing, that you have taken into account the actual association special assessments, which we're getting ready to talk about next. Okay, I see this a lot. In the contract at the bottom, where you have the addenda, you will see condominium rider will be first, homeowners association will be second. So many times I see contracts come through with neither of these checked and no rider attached. And if you don't have that attached, we don't even know how to deal with who's going to pay the assessments, what's due when. So don't overlook this. Really make sure you know whether or not your seller or buyer are dealing with a property that's in a condominium, an HOA, or both. Remember, it can be both. So I think maybe Prestantia, as an example, has condos, but they're also subject to one large, at least one, I think there's two as well, HOAs. You need both riders in that contract to account for both situations. Okay. So we'll jump to the condominium rider. In the condominium rider, there are a lot of things that need to be filled out by your seller that hopefully your seller knows. Either they bought the property and paid attention when they were doing that, sure. They're paying attention generally. They have a copy of the declaration and they can figure these things out. They have a good relationship with their manager and can help figure these things out. So the first thing I would do as we go through these items in the rider is to figure out where you find these things and how you determine them. So the first one is condominium association approval. Doug, where can we find out if association approval is needed?
Well, as you just said, your seller knows, right? Your seller either went through the process themselves because that restriction was in place when they bought their unit, or if it changed after they bought their unit and they didn't go through it, they were paying attention and they participated in that amendment process and know it that way, right? No, it's going to be in the documents. It's going to be in your declaration of condominium or an amendment. But again, like technically that's where it is, but practically I would expect, again, assuming you've got a seller who, pays attention to their mail, participates actively in their association, that they, know whether that's required or not.
Okay, or potentially the manager.
Sure, you can ask the manager, but those people are overworked and underpaid. So best of luck getting that information from a manager.
Okay, got it. So in the condominium rider, if association approval is required, keep in mind that the buyer and the seller have to use diligent effort to actually get approved. If the buyer's not approved within the time period that you fill in the blank on within the rider, then the contract terminates and the buyer gets their deposit back and we're done. I have seen buyers purposely try to tank an association approval because they decided after their inspection period or they're in a repair contract and there's really isn't some other out that they want to get out of it. And all of a sudden they have a giant dog that they knew wasn't approved in the first place, or
that's an emotional support animal.
Okay. This is not the emotional support animal.
Couldn't resist.
Yes. Education class. But we can talk about that later if we get questions.
No.
Anyway, a buyer has to use diligent effort to get approved. So this is not an easy out. This is not a gotcha. They need to reply to emails. They need to fill out the form. They've got to do the stuff that they're supposed to do to get approved.
Is there a standard? Is it like, does it say reasonable or anything in it? It just says diligent effort.
Diligent effort. Mm-hmm. Okay. The other thing that might be out there, and that comes up in paragraph 2 of the condominium rider, is whether or not the association or a member has a first right of refusal. And what that is, Doug, do you want to talk about what a right of first refusal is and where we find it?
Documents, always in the documents. And the right of first refusal is an opportunity to purchase before a third party can come into the community. So the right of first refusal might lie in the association. That's somewhat typical for condos if it exists. It might also rest in other unit owners. So if you receive an offer to purchase your unit, you might be required to notify the association, and then maybe the association will notify all the owners, and somebody with the right of first refusal would be able to purchase it on the same terms and conditions that you're otherwise wanting to accept from your remote third-party purchaser.
So before you sell it to the buyer that's under contract,
on the same terms, same amount, us first before you.
And the association can have that right in the documents. Members, other owners can have that right in the documents. Both could have that right in the documents,
Right.
or no one.
Right. It's not every condo. In fact, I'd say it's more often than not a right in at least in condos I represent. It's not typical. I mean, it
I would
exists, but
agree
it's
that
not that frequent.
it's not that frequent. Here's an example of one, because in the event that you know that a member, an association, anybody has a right of first refusal, you really need to think through and get some help on this. Reach out to, you know, an attorney that you work with on closings, the contract deadlines as they apply to this right of first refusal. Here is an example of a right of first refusal where where when they're under contract, they have to, before they can sell it, do a posting and a certified mailing. So posting on the public bulletin board, and then a hand delivered or certified mailing of the offer, and have to wait 21 days for owners to come back and say, hey, I actually want to buy that unit at that price. So if you've got to wait 21 days to know whether or not you're under contract, you really need to think about what your inspection period has, and the time to look at this and make sure that you're timely getting this together. Do you even have 21 days before closing? I've seen a right of first refusal push out closing dates before. So
you really got to game out the
right.
contract deadlines.
Yep. I just wanted to, under D here, is if within the time period the association members or both fail to provide written confirmation of the right, or it expires, then the contract can terminate and the deposit gets returned. So there is a way, you know, it makes for, the contract contemplates if the right of first refusal is not obtained or done, but just keep in mind that as you're setting closing dates and you want this to go through, you want to take into account any waiting period that you might have out there. Okay. Okay, special assessments. This is where we get into special assessments as they actually apply to condominiums. Doug, can you talk about regular assessments, special assessments, what they are and how they differ?
Sure. So big picture, every year an association, whether it's a condo or an HOA, sets a budget. That's the annual budget for whatever the fiscal year is, and the regular assessments are the assessments owed for that budget for that fiscal year. Special assessments come into the picture when there's unanticipated expenses. There's a special process to adopt those. They're not considered part of the normal budget. They can be due, in a lump sum. They can be due over a period of time, and they can be due on different intervals as well. And they're, again, typically not contemplated by the normal adopted operating budget of the association. They're the unexpected repair that the money wasn't set aside for. They're an unanticipated legal expense. They can be anything and everything that's a valid expense of the association. They just weren't contemplated at the time that the association adopted the budget.
And so in most cases, these will show up on an estoppel, but levied here means that the special assessment has been voted on and approved by the board. However, the contract goes one step further and requires the seller to disclose if a special assessment has been an item on the agenda or reported in the minutes within the last 12 months. So when you're getting ready to help somebody list a property, one of the things that you're going to want your seller to do, I mean, people just don't pay attention. They're not here all the time. They don't want to get into the politics, things like that. They should do their due diligence to review the minutes to determine if a special assessment has been discussed. Because if all of a sudden it comes up at closing and we get a copy of the minutes that said, hey, you knew within the last 6 months that there was going to be a $10,000 special assessment here, the contract contemplates that the seller has to pay that if it wasn't disclosed above by the seller within the contract. So if you know of a special assessment that's been on an agenda in minutes, a mailing, anything like that, it's been discussed, I recommend that the seller fills it out and discloses it here, so there's not any sort of gotcha. By disclosing it, you could eliminate any possibility that a buyer can seek the legal recourse against a seller for an assessment that comes up down the line. But if the seller discloses the possibility of an assessment in the future, then the contract protects the seller if an assessment's eventually imposed.
The buyer's risk.
Yep. Okay. sprinkler system. This has come up in a couple of closings with me, where you see people coming from different states that have different laws regarding what is required for safety mechanisms such as a sprinkler system within a condominium. I will say that in my experience, anecdotally, buyers coming from the Northeast, especially big cities, seem to be really tuned in to this issue. Doug, can you talk about sprinkler systems, whether or not they're required now, and what you do if your condo was built a long time ago and they weren't required then?
So sprinkler systems are systems of sprinklers.
Okay.
Anyways, so I don't really know the applicable time periods, to be frank, but there was a substantial period of time in Florida where those were not required by the Florida Building Code. This was realized and corrected and is now essentially required for condominium buildings of certain sizes. And they've changed this law so many times with so many deadlines, but the big picture is they're now required to retrofit if they don't have them, to put them in place by not earlier than January 1st of 2024. However, condominium associations through a vote of the membership can opt out. If they opt out, there's I think it's a majority membership vote. They're required to memorialize that, file something with the state agency that oversees condos, record a certificate in the public records, and otherwise make that information available to their owners as to the efficacy of the opt-out vote. So big picture wise, they're supposed to be there in the next couple of years, unless you've opted out, in which case there'll be something in the public records for anybody to discover if they're not going to put in place the system that the Florida Building Code would otherwise require them to have in place.
So practically speaking, you will oftentimes see this on your title policy as an exception. It was recorded in the public records and said the condominium association, voted to forego retrofitting, and that will just put you on notice that there, likely is not a sprinkler system in place and can meet the requirement of, giving the buyer notice of that. There's really not specific recourse written into the contract if written notice is not provided to the buyer. I don't think that this is a big gotcha moment, but people ask about it. So I wanted to make sure that we covered it here and you had actually heard something about it. Okay, this is the gotcha moment. In the condominium documents and in the statutes, the seller is required to give very specific items to the buyer for the buyer to review. And the buyer has 3 days from whatever the last document is that they get to review them and cancel the contract and get their deposit back. I have seen people use this where they're giving a 0-day inspection period, but there are condo docs or HOA docs condo docs. This is really 718. So where there are condo docs to review, using this as their kind of 3 days to figure it out. And what needs to be given. So first of all, check a box. If you're a buyer, you want to check 5B, in my opinion. It's not legal advice, just generally, because what that does is says, look, I'm requiring that you send me all of these documents. I haven't received them yet. And I get 3 days from the last day of the document delivered to me to review them and decide whether or not I want to be subject to these restrictions.
Awful restrictions.
Oh gosh. Okay. So if you check 5A, you're saying, hey, I've been given these. We're good. I don't need them. We're moving forward here. So to the extent that you have somebody who actually wants to review the use restrictions and figure out what they're, how much they're going to be owing, what they're liable for, what they can and can't do with their unit, they want a copy of these documents. And here are the documents.
They're also good nighttime reading.
They are not.
If you're an insomnia.
A current copy of the declaration. Doug, what's the declaration?
That's the constitution of the community that creates the condominium form of ownership for the subject real property.
And kind of outlines the restrictions.
Use restrictions, obligations to pay assessments, defines the unit boundaries, what you own, what is owned collectively, what the association is responsible for.
Yeah. Okay.
Who, what, when, where, why, pretty much.
Yes. And then, so we'll kind of do that for each of these. The articles of incorporation required to be given to the buyer.
That's the corporate formation document that sets out the basic structure for the condominium association associated with the condominium property.
Great. The bylaws.
deals with the internal operating procedures of such association.
How many members are going to be on the board, how they get there. Okay.
Yeah, terms, officers, indemnification,
Okay.
all that sort of stuff. Yeah.
And, oh, yep, we have a question.
I have a question. I have a unit, well, a home that is part of an HOA that I've never seen before, in that they're not allowed to transfer paperwork back and forth, and you have to order a whole new set of documents to the tune of $295 in order to proceed. Yes, that was my face.
So I think we are going to get into fees and what they can actually charge for these, right, Doug?
Well, in terms of requesting official records.
Correct, because there's a couple of different ways that you can get these documents.
Well, let's repeat the
Go ahead.
question.
Oh, okay, repeat the question. Go
So
ahead, Doug.
the question, the framework was every individual transaction requires a new set of documents to be ordered to the tune of $295. Right, okay. And that's a requirement of the association, I assume? Gotcha, okay.
Okay, so the contract
Well, let
does.
them know who their attorney is.
So the contract does actually contemplate this. And I believe, and I need to pull it up, that the seller actually pays for them. But let me fast forward. Because you're asking in the HOA context, right? Okay.
Well, in general, if they're required to be paid for, who's responsible for that fee?
Right.
They have to provide it within a certain amount of time for the discovery period. But
Yes, and I do have the answer to that, but I might have to come back to you. So I will answer that question. Okay. This, actually, I'll answer it here because I'm on the slide now. Under 6, it says, if the contract does not close, buyer shall immediately return the documents to the seller or reimburse the seller for the cost of the documents. The seller is responsible for paying for the cost of the documents because they have to give them to the buyer, and so they've got to pay for them first. If the buyer then does not close, the seller can ask to be reimbursed. Okay, yep. Just wanted to. Sometimes I got to look right at the contract.
But I don't think those fees would align with what the statute says the association can impose on their member. So just leave it at that.
Okay. Do you want to go into that at all, or?
No.
Okay.
We're going to
All
touch
right.
on that later.
Yep,
right?
we are going to
Yeah.
touch on that later. Let's keep going through the documents that are required.
We do have a question on that. Should the listing agent upload the current condo docs to the MLS if they are uploaded and the buyer has reviewed them prior to submitting the offer? Okay, to check.
Okay, so the question is if the realtor uploads all required condominium documents. So we're still going through this list here. So not just the declaration, but you upload every single document that's required here into the MLS listing. Can then the buyer check A? The buyer can check A anytime they want. They can say like, yep, I got them. They could have looked at them at the public records. They could have them for some other reason. Maybe they've got like a friend who lives there. Maybe they already live in the HOA or condo, so in the condo. Sorry, Doug is gonna kill me. Condo association, and they already have the documents. This has come up before. So sure, a buyer can check A anytime they want. I've got them, we're good, we're moving forward.
But is
But-
that actual delivery for purposes of the notice, right?
If the buyer actually receives them, so my understanding, I'm not a realtor, but that you're, an average Joe buyer doesn't have access necessarily to every document within the MLS, that it would actually need to be downloaded by the buyer's agent and given to them. And so that's why you're really double checking, like, hey, buyer, have you actually received delivery of these documents? And that is why there is a checkbox there, like, yes, I have, or no, I haven't, and I need them. And this is really important too. If you are representing a seller, I recommend that you get a receipt of the documents. Get it in an email, have them actually sign a receipt of the documents where they, if you really wanted to be super cautious, have them initial every document that they received. Because what you want to be able to rely on is if they down the road try to cancel on you because you gave them the budget instead of the year-end financials, you want to say, no, you said you received them. Here they are. Like, this is, you don't get a get out of jail free card here. I gave them to you. You told me you had them. If I am representing a seller in a transaction, I will always in a condominium, I will always make sure that we have some sort of receipt of those documents being received, because once these documents are received, it starts that 3-day window. So the last document that you get, you've got 3 days to cancel. And
That's
if they
calendar
don't,
days, right?
I'm sorry,
It's calendar days?
it is calendar days. But like everything subject to the standards of if it, ends on a Sunday, then we go to Monday. The other things, the rules and regulations, Doug, how are the rules and regulations different than the declaration?
So rules and regulations are supplementary and generally adopted by the association. In the condo context, they don't need to be recorded, so there might not be something you could find in the public records, and those can change frequently. There's a different process for adopting them, but they're in the hierarchy of documents. They're kind of like the lowest level of regulations, but they can and do directly impact use of property. They can regulate use of units. They can also regulate use of the common elements, which is all the property outside of the units that's part of the condo.
Okay. The next is the year-end financials. Now, this is different than the budget. I see a lot of people try to give the budget, like, this is what we think, 2021 is going to look like, or this is what we budgeted for 2021 and where we are kind of so far. The budget is different than year-end financials. Doug, do you have anything to?
Yeah, so year-end financials, every association is required to perform a financial report or an audit. They have up to 120 days to do that. So if your fiscal year is your calendar year, you might not have that available until sometime in April or May. And depending on when you're closing, that might mean that you're practically dealing with year-end financials from more than a year prior. But if that's the only available version, the most recent version, that's the version that I guess the statute says you're entitled to as a purchaser.
Right.
And it's going to be a backwards looking assessment of what that financial year was for that association, which again is can't be the current year, because you've got to have a completed one, and the completed ones don't come into existence for several months into the subsequent year.
And so to that point, if you have a really fiscally conscious buyer, they want to know what they're getting themselves into, what it looks like the association is kind of doing, and the decisions that they're making throughout the year. If you want anything else other than these documents that are in the contract form, you need to write them in. So the master insurance policy and what that covers in a condominium, the year-to-date financials, rather than looking at financials maybe from a year ago. You want to know where we're at now. If you as a buyer want access to any association meeting minutes, so if you want to look at the meeting minutes from the last 12 months, you need to put that in the contract and make it an obligation of the seller to deliver them to you.
You also need to be conscientious of timeframes, because there's a time frame prescribed by statute for the association to make those available to a current owner or member, and that time frame is as long as 10 business days, 10 working days. So just to game it out, they've got to make the request. It's got to be received by the association. That's what triggers the association's 10 business day or 10 working day obligation to make the records available. And then of course, making the records available to that party doesn't mean they've automatically gone to the purchaser who's ultimately looking for them. So I would say conservatively, if you're going to build in those additional disclosure requirements, that you'd probably be talking about just a minimum of 21 days for that process to play out, so that there'd be some time for a purchaser to not only receive those documents, but have at least a day or two to actually look at them.
Right. And the reason, thank you, that's really important to understand. And the reason that we say, you need to put it in the contract that you want these additional documents and who should pay for getting them and any timelines within which they need to provide them to you, is because the seller is the only one statutorily, the seller is the only party to the contract that actually has right to access these documents. So the buyer, even though they're a prospective purchaser, they don't necessarily have rights to these documents that aren't public record. Only the seller can get them. And so you want to make it a requirement that the seller actually get them and provide them, and think through what happens if they don't provide them, how long they have to provide them. So again, your buyers, you know what they're going to want to look at, or you ask them, you know, is there anything else that you're concerned about that you want to see? Let's just deal with it up front instead of fighting over it, you know, after the inspection period's over, or we're otherwise locked into a contract. Okay, now we'll get into copies of documents. So Florida statute does require condominiums with 150 units or more to have a website. And most documents, but by no means always, right?
It generally dovetails with the official record statute, but it's not exactly.
So
completely
most
overlap.
documents
Most-
are
most
available
documents, right.
to owners on this website, and an owner in a condo could access the documents and print them on their own and provide them to the buyer. So that's one way to deal with the cost. The seller can ask for the documents electronically for them themselves, but there is no obligation that the association provides digital copies. So you can ask for them and print them that way, and maybe you know, save some money, but there's no obligation for the association to give those to you electronically.
Yeah.
The seller could also make an official records request to the association, and then the association can and usually will charge you for the copies of the documents. And in a condominium association, they may charge actual costs for preparing and furnishing the documents.
I think it's actual reasonable. I don't know.
Okay.
I think the reasonable word's in there, but it's definitely, you know, it's not a profit center for the association. It shouldn't be a profit center for the association. They can basically pass through whatever the reasonable costs are, but nothing more.
Okay, and then what about if you wanted the documents in an HOA?
HOA is similar, except there's actual prescribed fees in the statute in the HOA context. It's, I think, 25 cents per page if the page count exceeds 50 pages, and personnel costs not to exceed $20 per hour. And I think there might be a time limit on that as well. So there's some better certainty in the HOA context. And again, that's a cost that the association gets to pass on to the person requesting the record. So that's the current owner or the seller, and you know, however they build that into reimbursements on them in their contract.
Right. Okay.
It's not $295.
And so here again, as we covered, if the contract does not close, buyer has to return the documents to the seller or reimburse seller for the cost of the documents. So if they return them to the seller, then right, the seller can use it for the next person and there's not reimbursement there. But if they go ahead and keep them, they can ask for reimbursement. I don't see, truthfully, anecdotally, I don't see this a lot. Like the documents are usually electronic or can be accessed electronically and they get sent that way. A realtor has a binder and like, you know, the realtor handles it and hands it over. You know, you don't have an obligation to do that. I'm just telling you anecdotally what I see. Here at number 7, if you were a seller and when you signed, this is just an example, when you signed the offer and you got under contract, if you were to at that time deliver to your buyer the documents, put it in the contract, say buyer received the documents on, you know, January 1st, 2022. And that's when you're going to start counting your 3 days. But make sure that is in line with the buyer requested the documents. And I honestly would still require a receipt in that situation. But at least if you've said buyer received the documents and you put it right into the contract to the extent that's true, this should cover your bases. And then the one other thing here are common elements. Doug, can you talk about overarching, big picture? What is a common element versus what is a limited common element within the condominium?
Okay, so condominiums generally create 2 forms of ownership. There's the units, which are owned exclusively, and then there's everything outside the units, which is generally common elements. It's the property that is owned in an undivided interest by all the owners in the condo. So it's generally the land that the condo sits on. It's most of the common infrastructure. It's the building. It's the, you know, the pool area. It's most of those amenities that are the actual physical structure of the property. Again, the common elements is owned in an undivided interest collectively by each of the owners in their proportionate shares. And then limited common elements are a subset of common elements that again, they're all still common elements, they're still owned collectively, but there are exclusive use rights that pass with limited common elements. They can be exclusive to a unit, they can be exclusive to a group of units, but they're exclusive to less than all. So there are commonly things like patios and balconies, storage spaces, garage spaces. Those are things that are commonly limited common elements, so that somebody's got, even though they own this property collectively, somebody's got the exclusive use to park in spot, 23 or 27, or use storage space H down the hall.
Right. And so what we want to do here is have the sellers tell us, like, what is your parking space number? Where is your storage garage? If it is something else, a private bike rack or a, electric car charger, something like that. Tell us what that specific one is, because the closing agent's going to go check it out. Hey, on the estoppel, we want to know, do they have a specific right to use one spot? Are they still using that spot, or did they trade it with somebody else? And if they traded it with somebody else, were they allowed to do that? Or was there a recording of that? Is there a record of that? In some cases, limited common elements can actually be insured via title insurance. There are very specific ways that has to be done. And so we just want to know from the get-go that the seller thinks that they've got a right to these ones, so that we can check it out and make sure that when the buyer buys it, that they're going to have a parking space, have an assigned parking space, have a garage, have a chart, whatever it is that they think they're getting. You want to look into prior to closing and make sure they actually have the right to use it. Okay, so this is the HOA rider. Keep in mind, again, like for Stancia, you could be dealing with both. You might have a condominium association and an HOA, and in that case, you need both riders. If you're only in an HOA, you only need an HOA. If you're only in the condo, you only need the condo. But if you've got two, don't assume that one has got you covered. So in the homeowners association context, there is a required disclosure, and the rider covers that. So it's really important to remember to attach this. The seller is required to disclose these things to the buyer. They need to fill it out. They need to say, what the assessments are and how often they're paid. They need to say whether or not there is a special assessment that might be out there. So these things are covered by the HOA rider. Here you also have whether or not HOA approval is required. Same thing applies here. The documents will cover it. A manager might know it. You would think that a seller knew it because they were probably subject to it or were paying attention when that rule or amendment to the declaration was
Lawfully adopted.
Lawfully adopted. Thank you, Doug. And then it also has an outline of the fee assessments and other association charges that need to be paid. So these need to be filled out. I sometimes see these come through and they're not filled out. The seller's claiming they don't know. It's just not smart to get under contract that way. Question.
Yes, I've seen that not filled out properly. And as a buyer's agent, it is attached to the MLS, and I download it to try to figure out, am I supposed to do anything or just get back to the listing agent or the seller to figure it out, even though they disclose the fees and everything?
Get back to the listing agent to have them. Oh, so the question is, if you've got the HOA rider uploaded and nothing's filled out and you're the buyer's agent, everything has been disclosed as far as what is due. Should you fill it out, or should you kind of kick it back to the seller and the seller's agent to kick it out? I guess practically speaking, fine for you to fill it out and put it in the offer and, ask the listing agent, have the seller confirm. At least then it's filled out because the seller's got to sign this page too, right? They're going to initial, they're going to sign, and that everybody's agreeing that this is what's been disclosed. So I think it's fine for you to help identify those fees. I think what I would tell you is never do something on behalf of a party, right? The party should be identifying and filling these out because you can subject yourself to some liability. But both parties are going to sign this. So best for the seller to fill it out. But if you need to kind of help identify those, I think that can be done between the agents just to confirm before the parties sign.
Does that track the HOA disclosure summary by the statute, or is that a different?
What do you mean? This
The
tracks.
rider.
Yes, the rider tracks the
Gotcha.
HOA by statute disclosure. Okay, so if special assessments are levied by the association and they exist as of the effective date and are levied, then here you need to figure out who's going to pay for what. So either the buyer can pay installments due after the closing dates. That looks a little more like a proration. Or if you check seller, then seller needs to pay the entire special assessment due. So say there was a $1,000 special assessment and they said that it could be paid in installments and only 2 installments will have been paid prior to closing. If you check that buyer will pay after closing, then buyer is going to go ahead and pick up the next 2 installments. If you say that seller's going to pay off the whole special assessment as to that property, and that's going to be done. It'll be collected on the closing statement, paid directly to the association, and that will be done. C here is has been added since the contract was updated in 2021. That just helps clarify that the seller has to pay all fines imposed against the seller or the property by the association, which exists as of closing date, and also any charges for the association to provide information about the property and fees. So this is where Doug comes in, right? There, we want to find out whether or not there are fines, what's owed, how much is out there. Doug, or an attorney like Doug, is often the fees associated with that. You want to talk a little bit about kind of fines, how they get imposed?
We in condo land?
We're in HOA land.
In HOA land. Okay, so fines are personal monetary obligations that are penalties for non-compliance. So you are parking a commercial vehicle outside of your garage and you're not permitted to do that, and the association goes through the process to penalize you for that, and you personally owe the association, if your documents don't say anything else, as much as $1,000. That's essentially what a fine is. There are limited instances where fines can become debts of the property. So it wouldn't just be an obligation of the person as an owner, it would be an obligation associated with their lot. There's a process to do that as well. The statute says that the fines can't become liens for less than $1,000. So you've got to have some authority in your documents to do that. And if that's the case, then it's probably been converted to a special assessment of some sort. And I would assume that would then, if done properly, would be disclosed on the estoppel certificate. So.
Right. And so that's where you'll find that, and how a buyer gets identified or is told how or whether a fine exists is on the estoppel.
And if the association's done it correctly, the seller should already be on notice of the fine, because part of that process of putting the fine in place includes some notice to the offending party who's subject to that fine.
Yeah. And one thing that you will want to make sure gets wrapped up before closing is that whatever caused the fine is no longer there, and
Right.
and is going to be an issue that then your buyer buys into.
Right, because fines could be for things like unapproved improvements. I mean, they might not have gotten association approval to change the exterior color of the home, or to put a certain paving surface down, or add a playground that might not be permitted. So you could be inheriting that problem if you don't nip it in the bud and
then you'd be the
figure that
one.
out,
Yeah.
right? You'd be stepping into the shoes, especially if it got disclosed on the estoppel certificate. If it doesn't get disclosed on the estoppel certificate, I think the association stepped in it, and your buyer probably takes free and clear of that. Because I think that's what the statute says. If you don't disclose it, you're free and clear.
Okay. So that is kind of the contract parts of this, right? These are the things that we should know, the things that we work through all the time, but it's not a perfect situation when you're closing on property, and your buyer, your seller will absolutely have questions that are kind of outside the 4 corners of the contract, and we need some help with. And this is also where Doug comes in. So we're going to ask you some questions that come up a lot in closings that wouldn't necessarily be a closing agent's job to know, wouldn't necessarily be a realtor's job to know, and kind of walk us through those, understanding that you're a lawyer and you're going to tell me it depends a lot. Okay.
It depends.
Yeah. All right. So first question that we get asked a lot is, what is covered by a condominium association's insurance policy, their master policy? What's covered?
Just about everything you can touch, with the exception of floor, wall, ceiling surfaces, fixtures, cabinets, appliances. They're specifically described in the statute, and if they're carved out, they're not subject to the policy, but it's, 99.5% of the physical structure of a condominium.
Okay. So with that insurance in place, what type of insurance is a unit owner required to carry?
None by statute, but if the documents mandate it, they might be required to maintain insurance for everything that's not subject to the association policy, which would be an HO6 policy for, again, things like floor coverings, wall coverings, fixtures, cabinets, things of that nature that are more ephemeral.
And oftentimes a lender will require this coverage as well, because that does add to the value of the property. And, you know, with those fixtures, cabinets, things like that, they are transferring with the real property. And so if somebody's getting a loan, sometimes you'll see that requirement for insurance beyond the master policy as well. Okay, so during an inspection, it's discovered that a leak from an upstairs unit has caused substantial water damage to drywall in the downstairs unit that our purchaser is purchasing. Who's responsible to fix that damage?
Depends.
Okay.
Depends on where the unit boundaries are, depends on what the cause of the leak was. Was it failure of the association to maintain, or was it something that the owner was aware of and failed to do something about? There's a lot of variables in there. It's not a cookie cutter, one size fits all answer necessarily. So somebody's got to figure out all those factors and analyze it and come up with an answer.
And so one thing that we've talked about is oftentimes it is, you know, the responsibility of the downstairs unit owner to actually fix it. But if it wasn't an insurable event, but that unit owner may have some claim against the upstairs unit owner, right, if they left the water running, or, right, you know, they were the causation of that.
Right.
Okay. Similar but different. During the inspection, it's discovered that a window's cracked. Who's responsible to repair that window? What about if it's a door or an AC unit, something like that in a condominium?
Same thing, depends on what the documents say. Is it part of the unit? Is it part of the common elements? And even if it is part of the common elements, it can still technically be a unit owner responsibility. There are provisions that provide if something's a limited common element, it may be the maintenance, repair, replacement responsibility of the party that gets the benefit of that component. So it's entirely possible that even if it's not part of the unit, might still be an owner obligation to undertake repairs. And also there needs to be some consideration of what caused the crack. I mean, if it's just normal wear and tear versus somebody that did something, that's an entirely different scenario as well.
And so oftentimes you can identify something in an inspection and it's not like in a single family home where it's like, okay, yep, we'll fix the sliding glass door, right, or, you know, we will address the roof issue. It sometimes takes longer than that to figure out who is responsible for it. Sometimes you need to extend an inspection period to get that covered and to get that figured out. And if you don't know who the responsible party is or how it's going to get paid for, if they're going to do it, you might need to get counsel involved to try to figure out, are we going to negotiate around this? Are we going to be able to close if there's a loan? Is the lender going to allow for it? So to the extent that something comes up and the seller says, well, that's not mine to fix, get counsel involved to try to figure out how you're going to move forward with that issue. Okay. Do we have questions up to this point? Doing good. We've taken them as we go. So one thing we thought might be important and that you might be getting questions about is aging condos, Champlain Towers, things of that nature. I'm going to have Doug discuss this. Doug is on the planned unit. I'm going to get the committee wrong. Condominium and Plan Development Committee for the real property probate and trust law section of the Florida Bar. And this is like the brain trust, I would say, of condo and HOA law and how we're dealing with these things that need to go before the legislature for consideration, case law that's come down and how it applies to your condo association. So taking the law and applying it to every day. Doug sits on this committee. And so I'm going to have you kind of cover this issue and things that buyers might want to be considering. And I'm sure that realtors are getting questions about as people are considering these older condominium units.
Yeah, so to build on the earlier discussion of, potential additional records to require if you've got a purchaser who's concerned about walking into a similar situation or an impending, building disaster, there are certain records that are potentially available to a seller as part of the official records of the condo association that might go some ways in assuaging the concerns of the purchaser about, what's being done, what protections are in place, what money is going to be available if something happens. And so I've called out specific provisions of 718.111 sub 12, which is the official record statute, and I haven't highlighted, but so from the inception of the association is required to maintain all these records. The first one is all current insurance policies of the association and condominiums operated by the association. So why is this important? Well, you want to know that there's insurance in place. You want to know the extent of the insurance. You want to know the amount of the coverages, because that's what will primarily come into play in the event of some casualty event that impacts the condo. More importantly, what is the nature of those coverages? So if you're concerned or you've got a purchaser for a potentially older condominium property, you need to be cognizant of the fact that what was permitted to be built when that building was done in the 70s or the 80s or even early 90s is not necessarily going to be what can be reconstructed under the current building codes. And the insurance that's generally required for the association is required to insure the property as it exists, so that you potentially have this gap between what they're required to maintain insurance for, which is what the building is as it exists now, versus if something happens and it needs to be reconstructed, they'd have to build to the current building codes, which will be more extensive and therefore more expensive. So do they have additional coverages in place to cover that gap? That's generally called law and ordinance coverage. How much is it? You need to look at those types of things if you have that concerned purchaser. Accounting records. So the accounting records we've talked about earlier, but what's important for the accounting records is the reserves. How much is set aside for the components of the building? Reserves are required. Reserves are required for anything that's in excess of $10,000 for capital expenditure, deferred maintenance, roof, painting, and paving. So that's a lot. That's the vast majority of the building. However, as I'm sure you heard, that reserves can be waived. Are they being waived? If not, are they well funded?
Do you mind if I pause right there on the reserves and waiver of reserves? A lot of times, again, anecdotally, these newer condo projects will waive reserves. They're a newer project. That for some reason they think that they don't need those reserves, and so they're waiving them. If your buyer is getting a loan, it is going to be very hard, if not impossible, especially now, to get a loan in a condominium that has waived reserves. So it was hard before. Champlain Towers, almost impossible now. So something to keep in mind during the, if you've got a buyer getting financing within that financing period, making sure that the lender has a copy of whatever it is from the association that they need. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay. So we talked about the audits there. Let's see. Oh, I'm sorry. Well, can you scroll up?
Accounting records, audits.
Yeah.
No, I can't. A copy of the current question and answer sheet.
Yeah, so the FAQ sheet Aaron has already covered. There's also a requirement for an insurance appraisal, not less frequently than every 36 months. That's going to be an analysis of what the value of the building is as it exists for insurance purposes. But again, that's the building as it exists, which does not necessarily mean that's the expense that we build it. So you're going to want to look at that insurance appraisal, make sure that that's been done first. And if it has been done, do they actually have the insurance that the appraisal suggests they should have for the building? And then again, do they need additional insurance? When was the building built? Are they going to be required to build it to more current standards that would be more expensive than what was able to be built when the building was originally constructed? And then
That was your insurance one.
that was my insurance appraisal. Okay.
Any other written records of the association?
Oh yeah, and then there's the catch-all. So, go back and look at prior budgets. There's not a requirement for reserve analysis to be done. I don't know how an association properly funds reserves without somebody coming in and doing that analysis for them. But even though it's not required by statute, most associations do it. And as such, you have this catch-all at the end of the official record statute that says any other written records that relate to the operation of the association So I think if you've got that concerned purchaser who wants to know and look at the reserve issue, they're going to want to know, has somebody come in and said that these are the reserves you'll need, and are you building them up adequately? Well, that's going to be based in some part on some reserve analysis. So they're going to want to, if you look at the numbers, you don't have anything to compare them to. It might look great that you've got $3 million sitting in the bank, but if you're actually going to need $10 million in the next 2 to 3 years, then you're sitting on a $7 million hole. So you need to have some basis to compare what's there versus what should be there. And that's generally going to come from something akin to a reserve analysis.
And so that is one of those things that, the buyer is not necessarily entitled to receive from the association, correct? Is that?
Right. It's not even a report that technically must exist,
Right.
but if it exists, it's there. And so, yeah, it's not on your checklist for.
And so to the extent
condo
that you have a
disclosure.
concerned buyer, you want to know that ahead of time so that you can contract for that. And essentially have drafted any sort of paragraph that allows the buyer an out to the extent that it's discovered that they weren't properly
Yeah, if they're not
having
funding
reserves
or there's been a reserve analysis and what they've got doesn't match up with what they should have according to the reserve analysis, your buyer's obviously stepping into some looming financial obligation that's probably above and beyond what they would expect, and it certainly isn't currently contemplated in the ongoing assessment. So there's
right. And so why this is by no means limited just to older condominiums. I think that you are going to see more people concerned with these in the older condominiums.
Yeah. So
with that, happy to answer any other questions. This is our contact information. If you wanted us to clarify anything, if you feel like we glossed over anything too quickly, happy to, chat with you one-on-one or answer emails. And with that, thank you. We love the opportunity. And, this is my last kind of big duty as the chair of the Realtor Attorney Joint Committee. Glad that I could rope Doug into it. And thanks so much. We really appreciate it.
thank you, everybody.